February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima. 0902 hours. The volcanic sand was still cool beneath Colonel Takechi Nishi's boots when the first shell screamed overhead. He had been a cavalry officer, an Olympic gold medalist who had once shaken hands with Douglas Fairbanks in Los Angeles, who had sipped champagne in Hollywood drawing rooms and marveled at American optimism. Now he crouched in a bunker, carved from sulfurous rock, watching the horizon through a slit no wider than a man's hand. The sound came first, not a whistle, but a freight train tearing through the fabric of the world, then the impact. The earth lifted, suspended for a moment in defiance of physics, before slamming back down. Another shell, then 10 more, then 100. The Americans had not yet set foot on the beach, and already the island was being erased. This was not war as Nishi had known it. This was something else entirely, something the Japanese High Command had not prepared him for, something no amount of Bushido spirit could withstand. In the folders carried by staff officers from Saipan, from Peleliu, from every island where Imperial forces had made their stand, the reports all said the same thing in carefully measured prose. American fire support capabilities exceed all previous estimates, but reports were abstractions. This thunder that turned men to mist and concrete to dust, this was revelation. For 3 years, the Japanese army had been retreating across the Pacific, island by island, reef by reef, each defensive position more desperate than the last. They had learned, painfully and at terrible cost, that the war they had planned for in 1941 no longer existed. The swift advances, the bicycle infantry racing through Malaya, the conquests achieved with mortars and machine guns and raw aggression, all of that belonged to another age, an age that had ended somewhere between Guadalcanal and Tarawa. What replaced it was something the architects of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had never imagined. An enemy that did not merely fight, but manufactured warfare on an industrial scale that defied comprehension. Japanese officers in early 1945 found themselves commanding forces that had been drained of everything: fuel, ammunition, medicine, hope. The average Japanese infantry division on a Pacific island operated with artillery support that would have seemed sparse, even in the Russo-Japanese War 40 years earlier. A typical regimental gun company might possess 8 to 12 artillery pieces, usually Type 41 75mm mountain guns, weapons designed for mule transport and tribal warfare in Manchuria. Ammunition was rationed to perhaps 20 rounds per gun per day, and even that meager allotment often could not be met. Forward observers worked with outdated maps, obsolete radios that functioned intermittently, and communication systems that relied heavily on runners, men who sprinted through enemy fire carrying handwritten notes as if it was still 1918. The Americans arrived with something different, something incomprehensible. On Iwo Jima, as Colonel Nishi watched the preliminary bombardment, he was witnessing the output of an entire civilization dedicated to the proposition that industrial capacity could be converted with terrifying efficiency into explosives delivered onto a target. The numbers were almost abstract in their enormity. The pre-invasion naval bombardment of Iwo Jima consumed 22,000 shells in 3 days, more ordnance than the entire Japanese army in the Philippines had fired in 6 months. Each American battleship carried more high-explosive shells than some entire Japanese divisions possessed. The USS Idaho alone fired 2,044 rounds of 14-inch ammunition during the Iwo Jima operation. Each shell weighed 1,500 pounds. Each shell was guided by fire control computers and radar systems that Japanese naval officers, had they been allowed to inspect them, would have classified as science fiction. But this was only the beginning. The naval guns were merely the overture. Japanese ground commanders, those who survived long enough to file after-action reports, wrote of American fire support with a mixture of clinical detachment and barely suppressed terror. Captain Inuye Samaji, who commanded a reinforced company on Peleliu, kept a diary that was recovered after the battle. His entry for September 17, 1944 reads, "The American artillery fires without pause. We count rounds, not individual shells, but salvos, 50 salvos before noon, 70 by evening. Each salvo is 6 or 8 shells landing within seconds. The sound becomes not sound but pressure, a physical force that turns the air solid. Men go mad not from injury, but from the noise alone. We have one Type 94 75mm gun to answer them. We fire our single gun once every half hour, conserving ammunition. They reply with 100 shells. This is not a conversation, this is annihilation with a human face." The mathematics of American fire support were, from the Japanese perspective, evidence of either industrial insanity or a fundamental misunderstanding of how war functioned. A single American infantry division in the Pacific Theater, deployed with 4 battalions of divisional artillery, 48 105mm howitzers, and 12 150mm howitzers. These guns could sustain rates of fire that exhausted the imagination. A 105mm howitzer battery could, when pressed, fire 500 rounds per gun per hour. The Americans seemed to possess ammunition in such abundance that fire missions were planned not around scarcity but around target priority. Japanese officers, accustomed to hoarding every shell, could not initially comprehend an enemy that fired preparatory barrages of 10,000 rounds before a company-level attack. But artillery was only one component of the mechanism that ground Japanese defenders into the volcanic dust. Okinawa, April 1945. Lieutenant Tadashi Kojo commanded a platoon of the 62nd Division entrenched in the Shuri Line, a defensive position that Japanese planners believed might hold for months. On April 19th, his position was attacked by a reinforced American rifle company. What happened next was documented in his report, written in a cave by candlelight 2 days later. The attack began not with infantry but with sound, aircraft 4, then 8, then 12. They circled like birds of prey, but birds that screamed with metal throats. Then bombs, not falling, arriving. Precision. Our machine gun position, which we had camouflaged with weeks of effort, was obliterated by a single bomb that landed within 3 meters. Then naval guns from ships we could not see, firing at coordinates radioed by aircraft we could not shoot down. Then mortars, American infantry mortars that fired faster than our riflemen could work their bolts. Then tanks with flamethrowers. Then only then the infantry. By the time we saw American soldiers, we had been fighting for 2 hours and had not yet fired at a human target. This was the signature of American fire support: integration. The Japanese army fought as separate elements: infantry, artillery, armor, air, coordinated by doctrine and training, but ultimately operating in parallel. The Americans had created something that Japanese observers called Sogo Seni in their reports: unified warfare. Every element of the American military machine was networked together through radio communications, forward observers, liaison officers, and a doctrine that treated fire support not as a supplementary element, but as the primary weapon, with infantry advancing to occupy what the shells and bombs had already conquered. Japanese soldiers, surveying American positions through periscopes and makeshift telescopes, noted the abundance of radios with something approaching despair. Every American infantry platoon seemed to possess a radio. Forward observers, young lieutenants barely out of training, could summon artillery fire from batteries 10 kilometers away and receive it within 4 minutes. The Japanese Army's communication infrastructure, by comparison, was a patchwork of field telephones whose wires were constantly severed by bombardment, flag signals that worked only in daylight, and runner systems that collapsed under sustained fire. American forward air controllers orbited battlefields in tiny observation planes, speaking directly to fighter bombers that could deliver napalm onto targets marked with smoke grenades. The average time from target identification to ordnance on target: 7 minutes. Japanese requests for air support, on the rare occasions when aircraft were available, took hours to process and often arrived at coordinates the enemy had long since vacated. The symbolic weight of American abundance was perhaps most perfectly embodied not in any single weapon, but in a practice that Japanese soldiers found almost spiritually devastating: the time-on-target barrage. This was fire support elevated to art form. Multiple artillery batteries, sometimes positioned kilometers apart, firing at different times so that all shells arrived on target simultaneously. The effect was not a gradual crescendo of explosions, but a single, instantaneous detonation of such magnitude that it created a small weather system of its own. Shock waves that traveled through rock, smoke that blotted out the sun, a moment of industrial apocalypse that left nothing living within the kill zone. Colonel Yahara Hiromichi, senior staff officer of the 32nd Army on Okinawa, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We had been taught that spirit could overcome material, that Japanese courage was worth 1,000 American shells. This was a beautiful lie that we told ourselves, because the truth we discovered on Okinawa, was unbearable. The Americans did not fight as we fought. They did not send men to die for meters of ground. They sent steel and fire and high explosives, and only after the landscape had been rendered sterile did their infantry arrive to plant flags. We killed them when we could, yes, but we were not fighting men. We were fighting a system, a machine that converted factories in Detroit into craters in Okinawa, and against this machine, courage was simply another resource to be expended." The numbers supported Yahara's bitter assessment. On Okinawa, American forces fired 2.5 million artillery shells, 750,000 mortar rounds, and dropped 18,000 tons of aerial ordnance. Japanese defenders numbered approximately 100,000 men. The arithmetic was almost childishly simple: 25 artillery shells for every Japanese soldier, plus mortars, plus bombs, plus naval gunfire. This was warfare as mathematics, warfare as industrial problem-solving. The Japanese had prepared for battle. The Americans had prepared for extermination. Yet within this avalanche of steel, Japanese commanders began to perceive something unexpected, not weakness exactly, but a revelation about the nature of their enemy that was, in its own way, more troubling than the firepower itself. American fire support, for all its devastating effectiveness, operated under constraints that Japanese forces did not share. The Americans were profligate with shells but miserly with lives. Time and again, Japanese officers noted that American attacks halted not because of fierce resistance but because casualties exceeded some invisible threshold. A company that lost 15% of its strength in an hour would withdraw, call for fire support, and wait. The bombardment would resume. Only when officers deemed the position sufficiently softened would infantry advance again. To Japanese commanders raised in a military culture that valorized death and treated survival as secondary to objective accomplishment, this American reluctance to accept casualties was simultaneously their greatest strength and their most exploitable vulnerability. Captured documents from the 32nd Army headquarters on Okinawa included tactical directives advising units to allow American infantry to close to within 50 meters before opening fire, specifically to kill Americans quickly, before they can withdraw and summon their artillery. The directive continued: "The American soldier is brave but fragile. His commanders value his life above the mission. If we can kill 10 Americans in an hour, the attack stops. If we kill them slowly over many hours, the shells fall without pause, and we die having accomplished nothing. The doctrine is therefore rapid killing." This was the paradox Japanese ground commanders identified. American fire support was both overwhelming and, in a perverse sense, evidence of a kind of cultural fragility. The Americans had built a military machine designed to preserve American lives, to substitute industrial output for human sacrifice. It worked. God in heaven, it worked with a ruthless efficiency that erased entire defensive positions, but it revealed something about America that the samurai code could not fully comprehend. The belief that every individual life possessed intrinsic value, that soldiers were not expendable resources, but citizens in uniform, that victory purchased at too high a cost was not victory, but tragedy. March 26, 1945. The island fortress of Iwo Jima was declared secure, though fighting would continue for weeks in the island's caves and tunnels. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 200 were captured alive. The rest fought until ammunition, food, and hope were exhausted, then died in their bunkers or charged into machine gun fire in final, futile, banzai attacks. Colonel Nishi, the Olympic equestrian, the man who had once been celebrated in American newspapers, was reported killed in action, though his body was never found. In the caves, among the twisted metal and volcanic ash, American Marines discovered something that would be catalogued and filed away in intelligence reports. Japanese tactical manuals annotated in the margins with desperate observations. Counter-battery fire impossible, American artillery displaces too quickly. Air attacks cannot be predicted, they come whenever called. Tank attacks preceded by 30-minute artillery barrage, take cover deep. These were the notes of men who had studied their enemy and understood with perfect clarity that they were fighting not merely another army, but the output of a continental industrial base that had converted itself into a machine for projecting high explosives across the Pacific Ocean. The final reports filed by surviving Japanese commanders in the closing months of the war speak of American fire support with an almost elegiac tone, the acknowledgement of men who had witnessed something beyond their capacity to resist. They had expected to fight soldiers. They had prepared to die gloriously in battle against an enemy they considered soft, materialistic, lacking in spiritual strength. What they encountered instead was an enemy that did not send men to die when machines could kill instead, an enemy that had industrialized warfare so thoroughly that the individual soldier's courage was almost irrelevant, not because Americans were cowards, but because their system had evolved beyond the need for mass heroism. The Americans had built a way of war that treated human life as precious and high explosives as cheap, that valued a corporal's survival over the expenditure of 1,000 artillery shells, that summoned airstrikes with the casual efficiency of ordering supplies. In the end, what Japanese ground commanders observed about American fire support in 1945 was not merely a tactical or technical reality. It was a philosophy of war rooted in a philosophy of life, the belief that citizens were not subjects to be expended, that technology existed to preserve human potential, that abundance was not decadence but strength, that a nation rich enough to fire 1 million shells was also rich enough to consider each of its soldiers worth saving. This was the unbearable truth encoded in every time-on-target barrage, every close air support mission, every naval bombardment, that America fought not with desperation, but with surplus, not with fanaticism, but with methodical, industrial confidence. The shells that rained down on Iwo Jima and Okinawa were not merely weapons, they were messages written in high explosives declaring that the American way of war was the American way of life, abundant, technological, and unwilling to trade lives for meters of worthless volcanic rock. The Japanese had prepared to fight gods. They discovered they were fighting accountants, engineers, and factory workers, and that these men, armed with slide rules and production schedules, were far more terrifying than any god of war.